You've probably told yourself this before. I'm stuck. Stuck in a job you didn't exactly choose. Stuck in routines that feel strangely automatic. Stuck inside a version of life that looks stable, but feels slightly misaligned. And over time, that sentence starts sounding like a fact. This is just how life turned out. But there's a dangerous assumption hiding inside that belief. You assume the structure around you became a cage. But most cages in adult life aren't locked. They're familiar. That difference matters more than it seems, because familiarity feels permanent. The routines repeat. The expectations stabilize. The responsibilities grow roots. And slowly the mind stops scanning for alternatives. Not because alternatives disappeared, but because the brain prioritizes stability over exploration. Your nervous system prefers predictable walls over invisible doors. And once that preference sets in, something subtle happens. You stop asking a powerful question. Not, what should I do with my life? A simpler one. What else is possible here? That question disappears quietly. You wake up. You move through the day. You fulfill roles. You maintain the structure that once made sense. And because the structure continues working, you assume it must also be permanent. But permanence is often just repetition. Repetition creates the illusion of inevitability. You repeat the same path long enough, and it begins to look like the only path that exists. There's a line that may feel uncomfortable when you hear it. You were never completely trapped. You just stopped looking for exits. Not because you were weak, not because you were careless. Because adaptation trained your attention to stabilize what already works. And stabilization is powerful. It keeps life calm, predictable, manageable, but it also does something else. It quietly hides the doors that were never actually closed. And the moment you start noticing that possibility, the structure of your life begins to look slightly different. Not broken, not destroyed, just less permanent than you once believed. The feeling of being stuck doesn't usually appear overnight. It develops quietly, through repetition, through routine, through the slow stabilization of life. At first, stability feels good. You build structure. You reduce uncertainty. You create systems that make your days predictable. Predictability lowers anxiety. Your nervous system relaxes, and that's important. But over time, stability can quietly turn into something else. It can turn into assumption. You start assuming the structure around you is fixed. You assume your role is permanent. You assume the direction of your life has already been decided. But assumptions are not reality. They are interpretations. And interpretations are shaped by repetition. There's a concept in psychology called learned limitation. It happens when your mind stops exploring alternatives because the current pattern has been reinforced long enough. You don't consciously decide to stop exploring. Your attention simply narrows. You focus on maintaining the system that already works. And the longer that system works, the more natural it feels. Eventually, it begins to feel inevitable. But inevitability is often just familiarity repeated many times. Philosophers have pointed to this illusion for centuries. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus once made a powerful distinction. Some things in life are within our control. Others are not. But the mistake people make is assuming that the structure of their life belongs entirely in the second category. They believe circumstances define them, but circumstances are often less rigid than they appear. What becomes rigid is our interpretation of them. When a path repeats long enough, your mind stops labeling it as a path. It starts labeling it as the only path. That shift is subtle, but it changes how you see your entire life. You stop asking, what else could exist here? And start saying, this is just how things are. That sentence feels calm. It feels mature. It even feels realistic. But sometimes it's just familiarity wearing the mask of truth. There's a moment that changes how you see your life. Not when something dramatic happens. Not when you quit a job. Not when you move somewhere new. The moment happens much quieter than that. It happens when you realize something uncomfortable. You may not have been trapped. You may have simply stopped questioning the structure you were living inside. That realization doesn't feel exciting. It feels destabilizing. Because if the structure wasn't truly trapping you, then the boundaries of your life might not have been as solid as you believed. And that thought creates tension. For years you assumed your life had walls, responsibilities, expectations, commitments, a system that felt stable but restrictive. And when something feels restrictive long enough, the brain does something fascinating. It stops trying to push against the walls. It adapts to them. Adaptation is efficient. It reduces stress. It keeps the system stable. But adaptation also changes perception. You stop seeing the walls as temporary constraints. You start seeing them as permanent reality. There's a breath-stopping truth hidden here. The cage was never locked. You just got used to the walls, not because you lacked intelligence, because the human brain is designed to normalize whatever environment it lives inside. Normalization is powerful. If something repeats long enough, your mind stops labeling it as optional. It becomes the default, and the default begins to feel inevitable. Think about how often people say things like, "This is just how life is. This is what adults do. This is the responsible path." Those sentences feel reasonable, but they also quietly close doors. Not because the doors disappeared, because the mind stopped looking for them. There's a psychological principle called attentional narrowing. When your brain believes stability is necessary, your attention focuses on protecting the current structure. You become excellent at maintaining what already exists. But maintaining something is very different from choosing it. Maintenance keeps the machine running. Choice questions whether the machine still makes sense. Most people become very good at maintenance. Few people stay conscious enough to keep questioning. And over time, maintenance begins to feel like destiny. But destiny is often just repetition without reflection. This is where philosophy becomes useful. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about something he called herd morality. He noticed that human beings often adopt patterns simply because those patterns are normalized around them. Not because they consciously chose them, but because deviation feels risky. Belonging feels safer than questioning. So people follow structures that already exist. Careers, timelines, expectations. Not necessarily because they deeply believe in them, but because everyone around them treats those structures as obvious. When something is treated as obvious long enough, it stops looking like a choice. It starts looking like reality itself. And once something looks like reality, the mind stops negotiating with it. You stop asking, "Do I want this structure?" and start assuming this is the structure. That shift happens slowly. So slowly that most people never notice the moment it occurred. Years pass, roles stabilize, responsibilities accumulate, and by the time discomfort appears, the structure feels immovable. But here's the uncomfortable part. Sometimes the structure isn't immovable. Sometimes your perception is. Because perception adapts faster than circumstances change. Your brain learned to treat the current pattern as fixed. Not because it is fixed, because it has been repeated long enough. That realization can feel almost disorienting. You begin to see something that wasn't visible before. You see that many of the limits you assumed were permanent were actually interpretations. Interpretations shaped by routine, by expectation, by social reinforcement. There's another breath-stopping line hidden inside this idea. You didn't get trapped. You got comfortable with the map. Comfort with the map makes exploration feel unnecessary. And when exploration disappears, the map begins to look like the territory itself. But a map is not reality. It's a simplified version of reality. Your life map was built from the experiences you repeated, the environments you stabilized, the expectations you internalized. And maps are useful, but they are never complete. The moment you realize that, your perception shifts, not dramatically, subtly. You start noticing something strange. The life that once looked like a closed system begins to look more like a pattern. Patterns can repeat, but they can also change. That doesn't mean everything in your life is suddenly flexible. Some constraints are real. Responsibilities matter. Consequences exist. But the mind often exaggerates how permanent a structure really is, because permanence feels safer than uncertainty. If everything is fixed, you don't have to reconsider. You don't have to question. You don't have to destabilize the system you've already built. But questioning is where awareness returns. And awareness changes how structures appear. You begin to see the difference between real constraints and assumed constraints. That distinction is powerful, because real constraints require negotiation. Assumed constraints only require awareness. And many people live their entire lives reacting to assumed constraints, not because they are weak, because the mind prefers stability over reevaluation. Reevaluation creates friction. Friction creates uncertainty. But uncertainty is also where freedom begins. Not dramatic freedom, not instant transformation, just the quiet recognition that the walls you adapted to may not have been as permanent as they once appeared. When perception shifts, something unusual happens. The structure of your life doesn't suddenly change. Your job is still there. Your responsibilities remain. Your routines continue. Externally, almost nothing looks different. But internally, the atmosphere begins to change. Because once you see the pattern, you can't fully unsee it. For years, your life may have felt like a closed system. Wake up, work, fulfill obligations, repeat, and repetition slowly trained your mind to believe something. This is just how life works. That sentence sounds harmless, even mature. But hidden inside it is a quiet surrender. Not a dramatic one, a subtle one. The kind that happens when questioning slowly disappears. You stop asking whether the structure still reflects your values. You stop asking whether the direction still makes sense, not because you don't care, because the system keeps functioning. And functioning creates the illusion that everything is settled. But functioning is not the same as alignment. A machine can function perfectly, even while moving in the wrong direction. There's a moment many people experience but rarely talk about. It happens late at night, or during a quiet drive, or when you're staring at something ordinary. Suddenly a small thought appears. This can't be all there is. You don't say it loudly. You barely even finish the sentence. Because the thought feels disruptive. But the thought appears anyway. Not because you're ungrateful, because awareness is starting to move. That small discomfort is important. It means something inside you is noticing the gap between maintenance and meaning. And once the gap becomes visible, your relationship to your life begins to shift. You stop seeing the structure as absolute. You start seeing it as something that was built. And anything built can be examined. There's a breath-stopping realization here. Your life may be structured, but structure is not the same as imprisonment. Structure organizes behavior. Imprisonment removes agency. And many people confuse the two. Because structure feels powerful. It organizes your time, your priorities, your energy. But structure only remains rigid when it is never questioned. Once awareness returns, structure becomes visible, and visibility changes how you experience it. Think about something simple, a path you walk every day. At first, the path feels like the natural way to move. You don't question it. You simply follow it. But one day you notice something. There were other paths nearby the whole time. You just never paid attention to them. Not because they were hidden, because your attention was trained to follow the familiar route. Life works the same way. Most structures we live inside were not consciously designed. They emerged gradually. A decision here, an opportunity there, a responsibility accepted, a risk avoided. None of those moments felt permanent, but over time they accumulated, until the accumulated structure began to feel like destiny. But accumulation is not destiny. It's history. History explains how you arrived somewhere. It doesn't define where you must remain. There's a philosopher who explored this tension deeply. Friedrich Nietzsche once described human beings as creatures who slowly become attached to the identities they repeat. The more you repeat something, the more it begins to feel like who you are. But repetition is not identity. It is habit. And habits can become so stable that they start to feel natural. But natural is not the same as inevitable. This distinction changes everything. You can remain inside a structure and still see that it is a structure. You can maintain responsibilities and still understand they are choices. You can continue walking the same path and still know it is not the only path available. That awareness alone alters the emotional tone of your life. The structure stops feeling like a cage. It starts feeling like a configuration. Configurations can change, slowly, carefully, sometimes barely at all. But the moment you recognize that possibility, the system you live inside begins to lose its illusion of permanence. You don't need to tear down your life to experience this shift. You only need to see clearly. And clarity has a quiet effect. It returns a small but powerful feeling. Agency. Not dramatic freedom, just agency. The sense that you are not merely reacting to life. You are participating in it. And participation changes the way you experience every structure around you. Responsibilities become decisions. Routines become patterns. Patterns become visible. And once something becomes visible, it becomes open to reflection. Reflection is where authorship begins. Not control, not domination, authorship. The ability to look at the structure of your life and recognize that it is not a fixed prison. It is a pattern you have been maintaining, and patterns can evolve, slowly, gradually, sometimes in ways so small that only you notice them at first. But those small shifts begin with something simple, seeing clearly. Once you begin to see the structure of your life more clearly, something subtle returns. Not excitement, not rebellion, something quieter. A sense of authorship. For a long time, life may have felt like something that simply happened to you. Events appeared, responsibilities accumulated, roles stabilized, and you adapted to what was already unfolding. Adaptation is efficient. It keeps life manageable. But adaptation can slowly blur something important. The difference between participating in your life and merely maintaining it. Maintenance keeps systems stable. It protects what already exists. But participation asks a different question. Is this still the direction I would consciously choose? That question rarely appears when life is running smoothly. It appears when awareness begins to return. You start noticing small things, moments where you automatically say yes, patterns you repeat without reflection, expectations you continue fulfilling simply because they have always been there. For years, those patterns felt natural. Now they start to feel visible. Visibility changes your relationship to them. You no longer experience them as invisible rules. You see them as habits, and habits have an interesting quality. They feel permanent until you recognize them as habits. Then they become optional. There's a breath-stopping shift hidden here. Choice doesn't begin when you change your life. Choice begins when you see that a pattern was never inevitable. That realization doesn't require immediate action. You don't have to quit your job tomorrow. You don't have to redesign your life overnight. You don't even have to change anything right now. But the moment you see a pattern clearly, you are no longer unconscious inside it. And that changes the emotional atmosphere of your life. Think about something simple, a conversation where you always respond the same way. At first, the response feels automatic. You don't question it, but one day you notice the pattern. You realize you've been repeating the same reaction for years. The moment you see it, something shifts. You may still respond the same way, but now you know it is a response, not an obligation. That difference is small, but psychologically it is enormous, because awareness returns authorship. Authorship does not mean controlling everything. Life will always contain uncertainty, unexpected events, constraints, responsibilities, but authorship changes how you stand inside those realities. Instead of feeling like life is pushing you forward, you begin to experience yourself as someone who is participating in the direction, even when the direction evolves slowly. There's another breath-stopping line here. You don't need a new life to begin thinking like the author of your life. You only need to recognize that the story was never fully written. For years, you may have believed the path was already decided, that the structure had become fixed, but now something is becoming visible. The structure was never destiny. It was a pattern you learned to maintain. And once a pattern becomes visible, it becomes open to revision. Not dramatic revision, not reckless change, just the quiet understanding that life was never a locked script. It was a draft, and drafts can evolve. Once awareness returns, you begin to notice something strange. The life that once felt sealed doesn't feel quite as solid anymore. Nothing external has changed. Your schedule still exists. Your responsibilities remain. The same people expect the same things from you, but internally something subtle has shifted. You see the structure, and seeing the structure changes how you stand inside it. Before awareness, the structure felt like reality itself. Now it looks more like a configuration you've been maintaining. Maintaining is different from being imprisoned, and that distinction matters because prisons remove options. Configurations organize them. For years, you may have believed the walls of your life were permanent, not because someone locked them, because repetition made them feel unquestionable. But awareness does something powerful. It separates what exists from what must remain. That difference is where agency begins. There's a breath-stopping realization here. The door didn't appear today. It was always there. You just stopped scanning the room for exits, not because you lacked intelligence, but because stability trained your attention to maintain what already worked. Maintenance rewards predictability. Predictability lowers anxiety. And once anxiety disappears, exploration begins to feel unnecessary. You stop asking questions, not consciously, gradually. You wake up, you follow the structure. You maintain the rhythm of your life. And over time, the rhythm starts to look like inevitability. But inevitability is often just repetition that went unquestioned. There's something slightly unsettling about realizing this. Because if the door was always there, then the structure of your life was never completely fixed. It was sustained by habit, by expectation, by the quiet comfort of the familiar. And familiar environments rarely encourage exploration. They reward stability. But stability and permanence are not the same thing. One organizes your life, the other defines it. Many people confuse the two. They believe stability means their path has been finalized. But stability simply means the system is functioning. And functioning systems can evolve, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. That's how most meaningful shifts actually occur. Through awareness first, through reflection second, through change much later. There's another breath-stopping truth here. The moment you recognize a door, you can never fully believe the room is sealed again. Even if you don't open the door immediately, even if nothing changes tomorrow, the knowledge remains, and knowledge alters perception. You walk through your life differently once you see the structure. The routines remain, but they no longer feel inevitable. The expectations remain, but they no longer feel absolute. The path remains, but you understand it is still a path, not the entire territory. That subtle shift is enough to change your relationship to your own life. You stop feeling like someone trapped inside a system. You begin to feel like someone who has been maintaining a pattern. Patterns can continue, but they can also evolve, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly at first. And that's the stage you're entering now. Not radical freedom, not dramatic reinvention, something more grounded. Clarity. Clarity about the difference between structure and imprisonment. Clarity about the difference between maintenance and choice. Clarity about the fact that the system you live inside is not the same thing as your identity. And that realization prepares you for the next step. Because once you see the door, a new question appears. Not, should I escape my life? But something deeper. If the door was always there, who have you been inside the room? And who could you become if you walk through it? We'll go there next. You'll find it in the description. There is something quietly powerful about seeing clearly. Not because it changes your life immediately, but because it changes how you stand inside your life. For a long time, you may have experienced your path as something fixed, a structure that slowly became reality, a sequence of responsibilities that felt inevitable, a direction that seemed already decided. But awareness has a strange effect. Once you recognize the structure, it stops feeling absolute. You begin to see the difference between what exists and what must remain. That difference may appear small, but it changes the emotional weight of everything around you. Because inevitability carries pressure. It makes every decision feel final. It makes every path feel permanent. But when you realize that structures are maintained rather than imposed, the pressure softens. You start seeing your life not as a locked system, but as something you have been participating in, even when you didn't fully realize it. There's a breath-stopping line hidden inside that realization. Your life didn't trap you. You adapted to the structure that once made sense. Adaptation is not weakness. It is intelligence responding to context, and context changes over time. What once felt necessary may no longer be required in the same way, but awareness must come first. Without awareness, patterns feel invisible. Invisible patterns feel permanent. Permanent patterns feel like destiny. But destiny is often just a story we tell about repetition. When the story changes, the meaning of the pattern changes too. You stop seeing yourself as someone who ended up in a life you didn't choose. You begin to see someone who gradually built a structure that once felt reasonable. And if a structure can be built, it can also be reconsidered. Not all at once, not recklessly, but consciously. That realization doesn't force change. It simply restores perspective. Perspective is powerful because perspective gives you something many people quietly lose over time. Agency. Not absolute control. Life will never give that. But agency means something simpler. It means recognizing that the story of your life is not a sealed document. It is a draft still being written. For years, you may have believed the next chapter was already decided. Now you see something different. The chapter you are living was influenced by patterns you repeated, patterns you maintained, patterns you inherited from expectations and circumstances. But patterns are not identity. They are simply the shapes behavior takes over time, and shapes can evolve. That realization is enough to change how you look at tomorrow. You don't have to force transformation. You don't have to redesign your life overnight. You only have to recognize something important. The structure around you is not the final definition of who you are. And once that realization settles, another question begins to emerge, a deeper one. If the structure of your life was never the same thing as your identity, then who are you inside it? And more importantly, who are you becoming? We'll explore that next. You'll find it in the description.